Right, Mandy was next, sorry. Yep.
Oh, thanks. I actually had two things, and it's about kids. The first one is when your child is like angry and blaming you or blaming people
Yep.
for little things. I struggle with holding up the law with that behavior. And what does that look like to like restrict that unloving behavior?
Well, it depends whether the thing they're blaming you for you actually did or not, doesn't it? To a degree.
Just getting angry about everything, like
Yeah, but normally a child doesn't get angry about everything unless they're angry about something in particular that they're unwilling to express, right?
So either you've got a child who feels very entitled,
either
or
that.
you've got a child who's very angry about something else that she's
that's
not
what I'm trying to figure out,
Yeah.
which one it is, to
Well,
see what my job is.
How did you bring her up?
How did I bring her up?
Yeah, did you every time she wanted something, did you give it?
Yes, mostly. And,
Okay, so
and,
mostly entitled.
and her dad and her grandparents were
All
like
did that as well?
Yeah.
Yep. So entitled,
That's
definitely.
what I'm feeling
Yep.
like.
So now, whenever she doesn't get anything she wants, she's going to be angry.
Yep.
Yep. How do you stop that?
It gets pretty out of control.
When you say out of control, what happens?
Just wild, like physically violent.
Violent, wild,
Yeah, just yelling, screaming,
Yeah.
just
throwing things.
uncontrollable. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Throwing things. Yeah.
Okay. So also probably spirit overcloaked, right?
Yep.
Yep.
So I've tried physically restricting her, like you've talked about.
Pretty hard. How old is she?
Very difficult. She's 11.
Yeah. When they're 11,
So-
it's pretty hard. It's like
Yeah.
almost like an adult body, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you'd have 2 or 3 people restricting her if you had to restrict her. Yeah. Difficult. You should have started earlier.
Yeah.
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 When they're like that, when they're 2, we have a young boy, Elias, his name is, who started that kind of manipulation with his parents because they allowed it. And by the time he was 2, he was already boss of the whole family. And they started to do things when he was 2. And as a result, by the time he's now 3 and a bit, and already things are starting to calm down because it's being dealt with properly, When they're 11, it's been let go on a long time. Yeah.
But Mandy,
years.
can I just pick you up on something you said? You said you struggle to uphold the law in those cases.
Yeah.
I would look at what emotion
She's
am
working
I
on your
avoiding?
guilt, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
that's what you're going to need to deal with in order to be effective,
Yep.
is to deal with your investment in her liking you, I guess, in a very simple sense.
Yep.
And whatever that is about for you, there's going to be reasons in you why you find it hard to tolerate your daughter being unhappy with you.
Yeah.
But once you're over that, having a law which is just as much as possible in harmony with and reflecting God's attitude about these things, God's laws, which means that there's always a consequence to the unloving use of will, that is going to be the best thing for her, isn't it?
Yeah.
You want
So
your
it's going
home.
to be a process of re-education.
Yeah.
She doesn't let me speak.
Well, you don't have to speak to have a consequence.
Okay. Yeah.
In fact, if you feel
What do you mean
need,
she doesn't let you speak?
Well, like
You're the
every
parent,
every
like-
time I know, and that's why
What's
I
wrong with
feel
you?
like that's what I'm asking myself. What is wrong with me?
That's right.
Like,
Well, obviously, if you feel you can't speak to an 11-year-old, then obviously,
I start speaking and she starts screaming at me, or she'll cut me off, or like run into her room, slam her door so she can't hear me. That
yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah, no worries.
So I'm like, okay, she's not.
Well,
hearing
that child in my house not getting any food, not getting any clothes, not getting any
Yeah.
any phones, any TV, any nothing, till they learn to treat me well.
Me. Yeah,
Yeah, and if they're 11, I'd probably kick them outside.
that's what I've done. I'm like, okay, you're gonna be outside now. Because
But I
of
wouldn't be
this.
giving them food or anything.
And
They'd have to work
I was
for it.
giving her food, yeah, too.
Yeah, I wouldn't do any of that
Okay.
if it's that bad. But you got to have some compassion for the fact that you've let it get that bad,
Yep.
too, don't you? It's like
Yep.
that's letting it get way out of hand
Yep.
too long. And so look at the reason why you've waited so long to deal with that. And obviously, she's getting supported by grandparents and dad, and that you need some strong discussions there with a concerted effort on the part of all of you to change this, because they're basically also taking on the role of her parenting. And so that if they're educating her to live this sort of way, that's very bad for her future. If she grows up to be this lawless, she's going to be a lawless member of society, and also from God's perspective, she's going to end up even if she passed right now in the hells.
Yeah.
And that's pretty unusual for a child. Yeah, but that's where she's going to end up. And she'll be isolated, and then there'll be a group of spirits working with her. If she passed right now, there would be a group of spirits restricting her every activity. Unless she had a loving desire, they wouldn't respond to anything she said or did.
Okay.
They would, if she became violent, they would actually bind her to stop her violence.
Okay.
Yep.
But yeah.
It begins with, if you start a lot earlier, obviously you don't need to do all those things, right?
And also, it's going to be so crucial now for you to deal with some feelings around this, to want God's attitude about these things, because otherwise you're getting undermined all the time, and you're letting it happen.
Yeah.
You know, so there's got to be big emotional investments you
yourself.
have in either not having conflict with her, or maybe it's your husband, or maybe it's your in-laws, or
Maybe it's all of them.
or maybe it's all of them. But you're going to have some courage to have the conflicts with people, and you don't need to be very aware. Like, I see a lot of parents trying to convince their kids to be good when they're already very entitled, and it doesn't work. They just go, "Oh, I'm getting attention, whatever."
Yeah.
You know, there has to be consequences, and you don't have to talk about it. If they come and want to know why there's the consequence, there's your opening, but that's them asking. If you've already tried to explain and there's no opening, well, now it's time for action. Yeah.
So you don't have to be violent back, but
No.
you do have to restrict their violence. And if that requires two of you holding her down while she wants to be violent, then you do that. Right? You know, what else can you do? You've let it go too long, and there's not much else that can be done other than that. You know, a person can feel their emotions without being violent. So that's the first thing. Also, a person who is allowed to be, as a child, completely unrestricted is going to end up being spirit overcloaked at some point.
Yeah.
For sure. Because the spirits love a person who is uncontrolled and
Well, they've got all these reasons. You live in the West. Wow. There's toys, there's diversion, there's all these things. A spirit, and
drugs,
there's no
alcohol,
rules.
all sorts of things.
There's no rules. So a spirit
No rules.
love that. You
Yeah.
know? And because the will of the child is so, what do you call that? Permissive. You know, they don't have any kind of morality internally growing within them.
No moral
So-
compass, no loving desire.
So
in
the
the
spirit
child.
is like, well, this is great. This kid will do anything.
I
I
want.
want to have some experiences. Here I go. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So very prone to spirit overcloaking as well. And, you know, that means you're not dealing physically just with your daughter either. You're dealing physically with the strength of a spirit who's with your daughter as well. And that often increases the muscular strength of the child. So it's going to require a concerted effort for more than just one person to deal with this. It's not going to be, if you let it go that long, when they're little, when they're 2 and 3, you can restrict them and the spirit leaves them pretty quickly usually. You know, we've had cases where spirits left them within 3 months, gone, and then you don't have to restrict a child anymore. And the child's more docile in the sense of not docile, because the idea isn't to make them docile with their will. The idea is just to get rid of the spirit who's causing their... So you get rid of the spirit. Now you can talk and reason with the child, and now it's a lot easier. And we've seen that happen with
Educate, yeah.
all of Eloise's children,
Yeah.
pretty much, particularly her 2 boys. And they were so monstrously unruly that they were destroying the place, her house, and punching her and kicking her, and we'd be talking to her and they'd be screaming and yelling and hitting her, you know. And once you deal with it properly, if you met them now, you guys would not think that was their history.
Not at all.
They're very well behaved, easy to get along with. All of them, including the youngest is 12, he cooks for himself, cleans up himself, does his own shopping, does his own washing, does his own cleaning, looks after everything. He knows what he wants to be when he grows up.
They do very well in school.
He
as
has
well.
arranged his own work experience outside of school with the people who, you know, he wants to be an engineer and he's worked out he can do that. He's done all that. He's 12. We now ask him to be a manager in God's way. He's 12.
Yeah.
One day he was managing some 70-year-olds. And he was telling them, look, you got some emotional issues about intergender emotional issues with your wife that you need to address because she's looking after you. And
They're pretty switched on kids' emotions.
but when he was 3, he was like
Oh,
bedlam.
yeah. Does your daughter have your build, Mandy, or dad's?
Build.
Yeah.
Physical.
Physical, yeah.
Mine.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she's not
Slight.
not a
She's
big
small.
girl.
Yep.
Yeah. And she's shortish too.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
So that's
but it's difficult to.
It's gonna take
restrict
two of
myself.
Yep.
We started when she was like closer to like 7, I think, and she was still just too strong, even for
Yeah.
and
It's
there
different.
obviously wasn't consistency.
No, there wasn't.
No,
Exactly.
This is the issue.
No, you got to be really
Thanks.
consistent.
Yeah.
And to break the hold of spirits on her, very consistent. Because if they know there's a little hole, they're going to use it
Yeah.
just by being consistent. There's a spirit who is restricted using the body of a person on earth doesn't like the restriction. So all you need to do is restrict them long enough for the spirit to leave. And once the spirit leaves, they won't come back because they know they're going to get restricted again. So they just go and try to find somebody else they can influence.
Yeah.
So yeah, consistency, and it requires both parents, consistency. And if it sounds like you've got number of parents because you've got grandparents looking after and so forth.
It's mostly my husband and I, but
Yeah.
we're not on the same page.
Yeah, so all need to be on the same page. It's very difficult if you're not.
Yeah.
Very difficult if you're not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You can do a like non-physical restriction, as in just restriction of the environment, if you like.
Yeah, so things
Even
like
each other.
mobile phone, TV,
Yeah,
all these other things.
all the addictions.
As
if
soon
you
as she
like.
enters
Yeah.
violence, though, what are you going to do? You're going to have
Yeah.
to do something.
There has to be some way to restrict
Yeah.
her physically.
Physically.
Whether it's, restricting
these are
her
things
access
that-
to you, if you like,
And
and the environment.
I must say that the things I'm recommending, you imagine how the media would take something like that, right?
Yeah, this weekend we're just like,
Yeah, and the reality is, some people we know have had the police call on them because other people have accused them, and when the police learnt that, oh, this is what we're doing, the police were going, oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Then they're not going to have to do it when they're 20, right? So a lot of times, the things you're afraid of happening won't happen. It's just, when you explain it and you're not afraid and everything, and you're doing
people
it for
meet
a
the
reason.
kids. People meet the kids and see that the kids are not traumatized. They're
Traumatized
actually doing well,
or abused in any way physically.
Yeah.
So, it all depends on intention, doesn't it, here as well?
And you being right in yourself, in your intention for doing it. If you're coming from a place of anger or punishment or
Yeah.
whatever, that's not going to...
Or blaming them for the situation they're now in, because
Yeah.
really it's not, they're not to blame, right? A child who's been let go by the time of 11, that is a problem that began when she was born, right?
Yeah.
Not just 11. So it's basically not good. Remember that when you became a parent, you were just as old as she was as a child. weren't you?
In parenthood.
In parenthood.
Right.
And most people are not educated to be a parent. So in other words, when your child was 1, you were a 1-year-old parent. In other words, before your child was born, you knew nothing about parenting. Everybody thinks they know something, but they don't, right?
Mm.
And then by the time your child's 1, you were 1-year-old parent as well. And when your child's 2, you're a 2-year-old parent. So you're still not a very, don't really know much about parenting yet, right? By the time you're 30, you might know, by the time the child's 30, you might know something about parenting, but it's not going to benefit the child. Right. Maybe another one if you had one, but not that one. And so the problem is that there's a terrible lack of education on earth about proper parenting. And most parenting on earth is unloving, right? And you can't punish yourself for it, but you got to correct it, right? You attack yourself for it, but you do need to correct it. You need to take different action. And a lot of times the action needed to be taken is going to trigger you emotionally because there's guilt and shame and all sorts of feelings. And then other people look at you strange, like, what are you doing with the child? I remember one child came to a seminar. He was about 2.5 years old and he was screaming all the time. And Mum came up to us and said, what do I do about this child? Like, this child's screaming at... So I grabbed the child, sat down with it like this, wrapped my hand around the child. Within 2 minutes, well, it's probably less than 2 minutes, it was yelling and screaming and kicking and bashing its head against me and all sorts of things, right? And I said, this is what you do with a child. She bore it for 2 more minutes. And then she took the child from me and never saw me again. Because she couldn't bear putting that kind of restriction on her own child who was unruly. Right? Yeah.
Thanks.
And that's fine, like if that's what, but I bet you now that child would be, I don't know, in its teenage years, it's going to be a pretty monstrous kid. Yeah, he was headed that way at 2.5 because of what he was allowed to do. He was allowed to punch his mum, kick her. How's he going to treat women when he's an adult? Right? It's going to be pretty bad. And we've seen children like that grow up over 10, 15 years. You know, we've been teaching divine truth publicly now for me, I started in 2008, it's now 16 years. And in that time, I've seen children like just born grow to be nearly adults, right? And you see the results of it all. And many parents come back to us 16 years later and say, I just regret I didn't take your advice back then, you know? Yep. Yeah. Because they didn't want to, or they felt it was wrong. But this is the way God acts with us, right? This is why we have laws, because there's penalties of laws, so we learn. And it's very important for your children that they learn that there is authority that is loving and caring, but it's for their own good, you know, because otherwise they can get overcloaked by spirits, damaged by others. You imagine a child who's this demanding and angry, she goes to the workforce. Is she going to be employable? The instant the boss asks her to do something she doesn't want to do, she will have a kick and scream, right? Right? And what is he going to do? Fire her on the spot, probably, right? And so they're not even going to be able to care for themselves.
Hopefully he does. You know,
Yeah.
sadly the workforce is not going that well, is it?
No, for the same reasons, right?
Yeah, and
everybody's going, aren't you good, you did that, and aren't you good, you did that, and nobody's getting anything done, right? Because they're all just virtue signalling everybody how good they are, doing things that they're not actually finishing or completing anymore. And this is why we're ending up with things being manufactured now that are crap, you know, that you buy them and you use them once and then you might as well chuck it away because nobody's thinking about anything anymore. They're all just virtue signaling everybody. I worry for the world coming up because these young people who have had permissive upbringings, emotionally permissive upbringings where they're allowed to control their entire family, what do you think they're going to do when they get control of the world? It's going to be very interesting. So this is why we need to change our parenting on earth.
Yeah. And the best way, for those of you who aren't parents yet, there's a few, maybe, not many, but, you know, get God's law, love God's law, because when you love God's law, when you really, you know, love the way that God has designed everything, you're going to feel drawn to create this law in your own home, and it'll be so good for your kids.
Yeah.
So amazing. They'll understand that authority can be loving, not punitive, and that it can create freedom. Laws can actually create more freedom and more happiness. And
But also what's free for your child must also be free for you as an adult and must also be free for other children. So if your life is a nightmare because your child has been given freedom, then that's not real freedom.
Well, and I would say your child is not free. She's a slave to her demands.
Yeah.
She's
Slave
not
to her
free.
addictions, yeah.
She can't create for herself. She can't care for herself. She's a slave to needing other people to do all that for her. So she's not free. The kids that we were talking about before, who can get themselves up for school, you know, iron their uniform if they need to, make their lunch, make their breakfast, come home, make their dinner, do the homework, go to bed, and mum doesn't need to be involved in any little part of it.
Yeah.
That's pretty free.
And the average mum who hears that goes, what, they're doing all of that? What's the role of the mum? Well, the role of your mother is not to be a mother, because you're not their mother. You are their teacher. God is their mother. So teach them what God would teach them. That's your role. And so, you know, that's what we need to learn how to do as parents. We need to learn how to be loving parents who will teach the child as much as we're able, teach the child what the child will need to learn in their relationship with God anyway.
Yeah.
That would be the best course of action. So that's what we need to do for our children. And if we do that, our children will grow up being self-responsible members of society who love other people, not just themselves, and who care for everyone in society, and who are thorough, and they are scientifically and emotionally capable people of living a life that is productive for the rest of the society as well as for themselves. That's how they'll grow up. But that requires some major changes in parenting. If we're just parenting because we want to look like we're a good mum, which is, or a good dad, and being so permissive because we had a lot of things happen in our own childhood that we don't want to have happen in theirs, and we get so permissive under those circumstances, then what will end up happening is the child will use that and abuse that and get to a stage to be a monster in their life, in their future, one way or the other.
And they're going to struggle. They're going to struggle to make decisions, have relationships, just feel good about themselves ultimately, because they're so dependent on everyone else propping them up.
Yeah. So these are necessary changes that need to be made, but you can feel, can't you, that if the average person heard this, they'd be in an uproar, like, how dare they suggest this? And, how dare they suggest a child be self-sufficient by the time he's 3,
How that's abuse. Yeah.
No, it isn't. You imagine the pride the child is going to have in itself, being self-sufficient in the sense of sort of emotionally self-sufficient by the time of 3 or 4, and then physically self-sufficient by 7, like where they're earning their own money and everything by the time that state is happening. You imagine how, when they're an adult, how they're going to cope with life. They're going to find life under all circumstances, no matter how tough it is externally, they're going to find it easy because they have that self-confidence and self-awareness that comes from understanding these things, right? Yeah. But what I would like, many of you are dying to do a wee now, but so we need to just have a short break, and then I'd just like to have a brief discussion about awakening. Can we do that? Yes. Yep. Good day.